Hi, everybody. So great to be here with y'all, and thank you to yourselves. Give yourself a pat on the back for showing solidarity to street vendors from all across New York City. And I see some folks calling in here from other locations as well. We got street vendors in LA, in California, in Washington, D.C., a lot of street vendor organizing going on all across the country. But today we're focusing in on New York City street vendors. So my name is Karina Kaufman Gutierrez. I'm here with my colleague, Jennifer Salgado, and we are here as part of the Street Vendor Project at the Urban Justice Center. Why is everybody here today, right? We're here because street vendors are a huge part of New York City, of our culture and our soul, right? Street vendors are parents, they're caretakers, they're community members and leaders who keep our streets safe. And vendors work hard day in and day out to provide fresh, affordable food and merchandise as our city's smallest businesses, right? And I'd love to see if folks can drop in here in the chat who your favorite street vendor is. Who do you go to every day that makes you feel like home? Even though a lot of us have these, great relationships with street vendors and really see them as part of what makes home, right? Unfortunately, the way that New York City and a lot of cities all across the country treat street vendors is by criminalizing and harassing them, targeting them with police, and often, denying access for vendors to vending licenses that they need in order to operate with stability. And so today we're really excited to be partnering with Team AOC, who's been, supportive of street vending, even long before she got elected, but once she's been in office as well, advocating for street vendor rights. And really want everybody today to have a good understanding of your rights to support street vendors when you do see them being harassed, walk away with more knowledge of street vending, and also be connected to Street Vendor Project and the movement for vendor power in the long term, right? We often, only people will get aware of street vending when there's a high profile incident, right? Everybody's, probably seen videos of some of our members, Maria, who sells mangoes at Broadway Junction, Diana, who sells fruit in the Bronx, getting harassed, right? Getting their produce taken out, getting arrested. And a lot of times that's when folks start to learn about it. But what's different is that those high profile incidents are caught on camera, right? And so today you're going to get to learn some of the effective tools that you can use when you encounter situations like this. So I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Jennifer, who's going to walk us through the next piece.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer here. Like I said, we're here to learn a little more about how to be an ally. And a couple things that we'll be going over today is the welcome, which we already did, then a little overview of a small review of a street vending 101, then the bystander training, and then how to get involved. And then lastly, we'll have a Q&A. But you can still drop in questions throughout the session, and we'll answer them at the end. Sound good, everyone? Thumbs up. Like to see some interaction from the very beginning. All right. So a couple of best practices that I wanted to go over is make sure that we're taking note, because we will be having a pop quiz here and there. So please be ready for that. Thank you. So who's SVP? So the Street Vendor Project is a membership-driven organization that champions the rights of street vendors, and we're an organization of over 100 vendors from across the 5 boroughs. We predominantly work in New York City, and we support vendors through direct legal representation, through our small business program, and lastly, grassroots organizing. Our work centers on creating a diverse community of street vendor leaders, uniting people across race, gender, language, and culture. We do have members from almost every part of the world. So that's like we take a lot of pride in. We work with a lot of vendors, and throughout the decades And most recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, street vendors have heroically stepped up to feed their neighbors. An example of this was collaboration with Congresswoman through weekly distribution at the height of the pandemic. And this was a collaboration that happened between vendors and the Congress. So we see them stepping up in many ways. And we see them involved throughout like the day-to-day life. They're not just a part of the culture of New York City anymore. They're more than that, right? We see this through the work that they've been doing. So just a reminder, everyone, we will be having consecutive interpretation. So I will be first asking the question in English and then repeating it in Spanish for Maria. And then after she responds, I will be interpreting for her. So to start, Maria, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How long have you been vending? Where are you originally from? Tell us about where you live and where you work. Compañera María, si es que se puede presentar, decirnos su nombre y hablarnos un poquito sobre cuántos años lleva siendo vendedora ambulante, qué es lo que vende, a dónde vive y a dónde vende.
Sí, buenas tardes. Yo soy María López. Yo vendo en el Bronx, en la 149 y Tercera Avenida. Mi domicilio es en Corona, Queens. Sorry.
Okay. So Maria is, sorry, y'all, I think the spotlight is only on me. Can we make sure that it's also on Maria? Okay, thank you. Oh, I lost her. Okay. So her name is Maria Lopez. She is a street vendor, a general merchandise vendor, and she has been vending for, perdón, compañera María, ¿me puede recordar cuántos años tiene vendiendo?
7 años.
Okay, so Maria has been for years. Although she lives in Corona, Queens, she is a vendor in the South Bronx. Cuéntenos un poco sobre lo que vende. Can you tell us a little bit about what you vend?
¿Lo que yo vendo?
Sí.
Sí. Juguetes, gorras, pulseras, todo un poco.
Okay. So Maria sells a little bit of everything, bracelets, hats, toys, yeah, a little bit of everything. Thank you, Maria. Ahora, Maria, can you tell us why?
Fue la señal.
Ahora, compañera María, si es que usted puede compartir un poquito sobre por qué escogió esta industria. Y también si es que puede compartir una cosa que le guste acerca de estar en esta industria como vendedora ambulante.
Me produce un poco más de ganancias que un trabajo normal. Y después de la pandemia yo trabajaba anteriormente 3 días en laundry, los demás días me dedicaba a vender, pero ese trabajo se terminó y ahora me dedico completo a vender.
Okay.
Después de la pandemia.
So for Maria, she sees that she's able to generate more income than with her previous job. Before the pandemic, she worked at a laundromat for 3 days. And unfortunately, that job ended with the pandemic. And so she dedicated herself full time to become a vendor during the pandemic, as that generated more money and income for her. Okay. Y compañera María, ¿cuál ha sido su experiencia con las áreas de la ciudad? So Maria, can you share a little bit about your experience with street vendor enforcement?
Malas y buenas. Algunas veces se portan un poco groseros, inclusive un poco racistas, diría yo, porque me preguntan de qué país son y de qué país soy, y eso yo pienso que no tiene nada que ver.
Okay. Can you share what one positive experience that you've had? Or just, can you expand a little bit about your experience with them? Entonces, quiero que usted comparta un poquito más sobre la experiencia que ha tenido con ellos. Me acuerdo que estaba contándome por teléfono que usted ha tenido buenas y malas experiencias, sí, pero que también ha funcionado en que si es que se acercan a usted, usted puede recoger sus cosas y se va. ¿Puede un poquito sobre eso?
Sí, la última vez eso me pasó. Me dijeron que tenía que irme o si no me iban a dar un ticket. Tenía que recoger en 20 minutos, porque si no me daban el ticket o estaba incluso la policía al lado de ellos.
Right. So Maria is sharing that she's had positive and some negative experiences with enforcement. Sometimes some of the agents have been a little discriminatory or racist towards her. She was one instance where an agent asked her where her origin she was or where she was originally from and automatically assumed that she was Mexican. And she does share that another experience that she's had is with an agent who asked her if she has, she said no. And they allowed her to pick up her things and leave for the day. And that, again, a negative and positive experience, but she has experienced a little bit of everything. Okay, entonces, última cosa que le quiero preguntar. ¿Hay algo que usted le quisiera dejar saber a la audiencia que le está escuchando hoy en día? Algo que los dejar, que les quiera dejar, o algo que usted les quiera pedir? Is there, so one last question for you, Maria. Is there anything that you want to share with the people listening here today?
Oh, sí, muchas gracias por lo que están haciendo por nosotros, porque somos unas personas que no podemos, pues no tenemos ni voz ni voto en este país y ustedes están hablando por nosotros y estamos muy agradecidos por eso.
So Maria says thank you for the work that everyone has done in one way or another. She often feels like she doesn't have a voice or a vote in this country, but seeing that there are people who advocate for her and advocate for others in this industry makes her have hope. So thank you for that. So thank you, Maria, for taking the time from your busy up since 6 o'clock in the morning. Compañera María, gracias por tomarse el tiempo de hablar con nosotros esta tarde. Sé que usted estaba despierta desde las 6 de la mañana, así que gracias por todo el trabajo que hace y por compartir un rato con nosotros.
Muchas gracias a ustedes por haberme invitado.
Buenas tardes.
Muchas gracias, María. Thank you, Jennifer, for translating as well for everybody. I just want to uplift a few things that Maria said, right? One, that she started vending during the pandemic because she had lost her job, right? And so many folks started vending as a source of income, just like Maria, because they had lost their jobs and didn't have access to unemployment insurance, right? Another thing that she mentioned is that, you know, there's days where enforcement comes by and tells her to pick up and leave, right? And that's a nice enforcement officer who gives her the opportunity to leave. And the reason why is because something we're going to talk about today is that, you know, Maria can't get a license to vend because there's a cap, right? And we're going to delve into that a little bit more. And the other thing, you know, that she shared is she doesn't often feel like she has a voice or a vote, right? And street vendors are primarily immigrants. And a lot of folks within the community can't vote as well, right? Which starts to lessen political power because some elected officials will only vote in support of those who are going to vote for them, right? So a lot of different things that make it the way that street vending is right now. So with that in mind, gracias otra vez, Maria. Thank you again, Maria. We're going to switch into Street Vending 101. So this is one of the most complicated, ridiculous, nonsensical policy failures ever, street vending, right? And we're going to go more into depth now about New York City street vendors. But just to start off, right, as we mentioned before, there's about 20,000 street vendors in New York City, primarily immigrants, people of color, women, and military veterans, who are a very important part of the economy. And street vending is as old as New York City, right? This has been the industry of choice for new immigrants and New Yorkers who are excluded from the formalized economy for centuries. But street vending, which we're going to talk about a little bit more now, is broken down into different categories, into food vending, general merchandise, and First Amendment vendors. Next slide, please. And shout out to Pia on the back end who's navigating all the slides. So for food vendors, right? This is what folks usually think of when they think of street vending, especially in New York City. You think of your halal cart, you think of your mango lady, you think of the churros, right? And so mobile food vending encompasses anyone who sells something from the streets and sidewalks that you would eat. There's a very strict regulatory system that street vendors have to follow. It's very similar to restaurants, and actually, in fact, it's even more strict. And you can think of the way that restaurants that are open kitchens, right? Street vending is the most open of kitchens. Everything you do is visible to potentially thousands of people each day. But so street vendors, as food vendors, in order to operate, need to have two things. The first is a mobile food vendor license. So that's for the individual, right? Every single person, whether you own a cart or work on somebody else's, you need to have a mobile food vendor license, which means that you've passed Department of Health food safety courses. It means you pay taxes. And it means you have studied these ridiculous and very long-standing rules and regulations of street vendor siting. And then the second thing that you need in order to operate is a mobile food vendor permit. And so the permit is what actually goes on the cart or truck that you work from. And then just to go over a little bit some of the expenses that vendors pay, right? They pay rent to commissary kitchens. So every food truck or cart has to go for cleaning every 24 hours into a commissary kitchen. A lot of those are located in Midtown, some are in the Bronx, a lot in Long Island City. They also have to pay workers' comp to employees, food costs, licensing, and permitting costs as well. The second category of vendors is general merchandise vendors. So these are folks who sell clothing, merchandise, pottery. And in order to sell merchandise, you need to have what's known as a general vendor license. And in order to obtain a general vendor license, there's also a number of rules and regulations that you must follow. So you need to have a New York State sales tax ID, proof of address, and identity in order to get a license. And then there's a number of restrictions in place for vendors as well who sell merchandise. So you can't vend in certain parts of Midtown. This is called the Midtown box. You also can't vend on about 300 restricted streets. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other rules. There's also a special category of vendors called First Amendment vendors as well. So these are folks who sell items that are protected under the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. So people who sell artwork or books. So those folks don't need a license, but they do need a sales tax ID. And then the fourth category is military veterans. So military veterans have a very special category of license because of their service to the nation. And actually back in the 1890s, New York state legislators enshrined into law that wounded Civil War veterans could make a living as street vendors. So there's no restrictions on certain types of permits for vendors who are military veterans. And then for vendors, I think vendors, when you're looking where you can set up, there's almost a set of, for almost every single city block, there's a different set of rules, right? Some are very constant, but it depends on how these rules interface with your city block, right? So a couple different things you can see and hear from this image. So all vendors need to operate on a sidewalk that's 12 feet or wider. You must be 10 feet away from a crosswalk. For mobile food vendors, the shadow of the footprint of your cart can be no larger than 5 by 10. You can't have boxes on the ground. They all need to be on a table. So this, just goes to show just how heavily regulated street vending actually is for where people can and can't set up. If you are out of line with any of these rules, you could face fines, as well as potentially have your permit revoked. And so, we've gone over a little bit about what the street vending industry consists of right now, right? How do you get a license though? That's the question. If you want to become a street vendor, how do you actually enter into this system? If you want to start up a food cart or truck, how do you do that? And the reality is there's actually no legal way to become a street vendor in New York City. There's actually been a cap on the number of licenses for general vendors, so folks who sell merchandise, and a cap on the number of mobile food vendor permits in place since the early 80s. So the cap on general vendor licenses has been 853 total for all of New York City since 1979. And the cap on mobile food vendor permits has been in place since 1983. And as a result, right, when you think about this, there's about 20,000 street vendors and only about, less than a quarter of actual license and permits available, right? Which has created this really imbalanced system where folks like Maria, right, who are looking to open a small business, who are looking for ways to provide for their families, and who are seeing opening a small business as the way to do so as a street vendor, there's actually no way for them to do so that's legal and safe in the eyes of the city, right? As a result, for food vendors, there's this underground market that's been created because of such high demand for little supply, where there's actually an underground market where permit holders who got their permit back in the day in the 70s and the 80s are renting them out to the vendors who actually work, right? And they're renting them out for between $25,000, $30,000 every 2 years. When if you were to get it from the city itself, it's $200 every 2 years. So that markup, of which vendors have no legal claim over, right? There's no contract, it's a cash business of renting a permit. That permit owner can take it away at any point. Has escalated to the point where it's $25,000 to $30,000. Or if you don't have that kind of capital, you face, and you're trying to work without a permit or a license, you face $1,000 fine blanket, right? That's not even something we can fight in court. If you're unpermitted or unlicensed, the $1,000 fine. And so why is there this cap in place, right? That's a question you might be asking yourself. It seems ridiculous. There's tens of thousands of people who want to open a business, and we love our Birrialandias, and we love all of our food trucks, right? But there's a reason that this is in place. This cap has been put in place for so long. The majority of the rules and regulations that were passed have distinct racist and anti-immigrant underpinnings, right? Backed by corporate real estate. And during Rudy Giuliani, especially, I see Ed Koch getting shouted out here, Mayor Koch getting shouted out in the chat. He was the one who originally implemented the caps, but also Rudy Giuliani closed off, hundreds of streets for street vendors to be able to operate on, even those who have a permit. Donald Trump in the 1980s led prohibitions on military veteran vendors around his Midtown properties. So only 100 disabled military veterans can work in Midtown, right? So there's all of these, like, peeling back the layers of why does this cap exist in place really shows how the criminalization of street vending has emerged. So there's, we've talked about the rules and regulations, right? How complicated and strict they are. for where you can and can't set up. We've also talked about why these rules came into place. And now we can talk about enforcement, right? As you can see here on the screen, there's a very complicated web of street vending enforcement. Who oversees it? Who charges people? Can you get arrested? All of this is really based on what type of land you're standing on when you're street vending. So for example, in the subway, that is overseen by transit police, right? So for someone who's selling in the subway, that is a crime in the eyes of the city and the state. It's illegal to vend in the subways, and that's overseen by transit police. If you're vending in a park, you're overseen by the Parks Department. So when you see people on the boardwalks, right, on Coney Island, that's Parks Department. If you see somebody selling in Central Park, that's Parks Department. And then if you're selling from the streets and sidewalks, prior to January 2021, NYPD was actually in charge of vending enforcement, but that had led to frequent arrests and property confiscation for unpermitted vending. And then after January 2021, after many years of advocacy from street vendors doing actions, rallies, phone banking, I'm sure a lot of people who are here today participated in that. There was a bill that was passed for the first time in 38 years that gradually lifts the cap on mobile food vendor permits, but only a certain amount. And it created the Office of Street Vendor Enforcement, which is now housed within the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, which is a civilian agency. So that's them here up at the top, NYC Consumer and Worker Protection. So they're technically the ones who oversee all of these different agencies. So if people call 311 to complain about a street vendor, it gets routed to DCWP, Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. And so as of January 15th, they were supposed to be in charge of overseeing, right? But in reality, there have been a lot of issues with how that's gone into place in practice. And I know we're going over a lot of information as well, so definitely drop your questions in the chat or bring them in for later so we can have them answered. But so this slide here, right, is showing, though this has been a civilian agency overseeing street vending, there's actually been the NYPD continuing to issue fines at similar rates to DCWP. So you can see in here when the transition took place, NYPD in April through June 2021, July through September 2021, was giving out essentially the same amount of tickets as DCWP. And then in the first quarter, so in the first 3 months, January, February, and March of 2022, DCWP and NYPD both continued to issue fines to street vendors. And they issued more fines in this first quarter of 2022 than were issued in the same time period in 2019, so pre-pandemic, right? So we're actually seeing that there's more enforcement of street vendors now because NYPD and DCWP and everybody else, frankly, is fining and targeting street vendors. And if you're getting mad, you should be, right? This system is ridiculous. There's no way to succeed. It is really what it feels like. And then, there's a question of where this enforcement takes place, right? So the majority of enforcement in 2021 and 2022 has taken place in neighborhoods in New York City where there's the highest amount of immigrant populations, right? So you see in 2021, Jackson Heights right at the top. You see Sunset Park. You see Corona, you see Elmhurst, you see Washington Heights. These are all neighborhoods in New York City where there's primarily immigrant populations and that's where street vendors are working close to home. So even if there's not even the most amount of complaints being issued there, it's where the most enforcement takes place. These are also the communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, right? So where a lot of folks have started street vending. Now I'm going to kick it over to Jennifer, who's going to take us through the next session.
All right. So thank you, Karina, for sharing all that useful information and background. And so we've heard from Karina, we've heard the background. Now we'll finally get to review what are some you can take to be a better ally to vendors. So what is bystander intervention? Bystander intervention is built on the idea that we all play a role in creating safe public spaces for each other when we see our neighbors and community members facing bias, discrimination, or harassment. And as of lately, there has been an increase in ever since the economy reopened, resulting in a rise in ticketing, arrests, and confiscation of goods. Because of this, it's important now more than ever that we step up to keep our community safe. Next slide, please, Pia. Okay. So while we want to ensure there's find allies, day-to-day person, we also want to make sure that you're staying safe and are aware of the do's and don'ts as you step up in your role as a bystander. So you do have the right to film officers as long as you are not disrupting. So this relates to recording certain law enforcement activities, and provided that a person under arrest or in custody law enforcement official has a right to record police activity and to maintain custody and control of that recording and of any body or instruments used by that person to record police activities. However, a person in custody or under arrest not by that status alone forfeit such right to record. So very like legal jargon, but it's necessary. Second thing, showing your ID. In New York City, you don't have to show ID to a police officer unless the NYPD has probable cause. If you are issued a summons or arrest and refuse to produce ID or tell officers who you are, the police may detain you until you can be positively identified. And I do want to preface this also saying that does not apply to vendors. Vendors should be complying and should ID. And so I do want to issue a trigger warning. We're going to show the arrest of a vendor and what it looks like what a bystander intervention can look like in real time. So yeah, if you can show the video real quick, and you'll probably recognize this from social media.
Oh my God.
So one thing right off the bat that I want to signal is that there's distance between the person filming and the actual interaction happening. Thank you, Pia. And so again, one thing that's super important is that you don't involve yourself directly within the interaction that's going on, because you do risk arrest. A good thing that we saw them do, and actually the person who was filming this is the daughter of Maria, I believe it's Maria Falcon, who we see here getting arrested. And once circled social media channels, yeah, to Robert's point, things can get dicey, to sum it up. And so we want to make sure that you are keeping safe distance from interaction. And now we're going to jump into a little bit about identification and what that looks like and how you can analyze the situation. So we've seen different agencies get involved, and Karina went over that a little bit. And sometimes you may not be able to tell right off the bat, just looking at a person talking to a, but sometimes both DCWP and NYPD officers wear plain clothes. Now, this has been an issue for many reasons. If they are uniformed, NYPD officers will be marked as NYPD with a little badge. or City of New York Police. You can, again, look at their little patches, their badges, vehicles, and bats. Lately, we have been seeing FPD using uniform whenever they go and interact with vendors, but this is not always the case. And DCWP officers are usually seen wearing shirts with the name and holding an iPad or and here we see some interactions of just that. These are some images shared by actual vendors and some of them also by the media. We see NYPD here with their badges and logos in the back. We see also DSN, I believe this is Parks. No, DSN, yeah, Parks and DSNY here. Bottom, if folks remember, this is an image taken from an incident that happened with Diana up in the Bronx. Okay. And so these are just some of the types of incidents. So as you can see, these are all of the agencies that do eventually we've seen to get involved with NYPD. So now it's down to the nitty of things. So one thing that I do want to say before you analyze the situation and before you get out your camera, it's important that you take note that this is a collaborative effort between you and the vendor. And I'm going to go into that in a second. So there are two instances that you'll usually run into. One is a developing situation. And here you can ask the vendor, are you okay? Do you need assistance? Is it okay to film? You always want to make sure that you are communicating with the vendor themselves. Check the situation first and ask yourself, what's going on? How many officers are there? How escalated is the incident? If an incident is already escalated, officers may escalate it even more if there's someone documenting close to them. So this is also why it's important to keep your distance. Are there other people watching and documenting? That's a developing situation. An escalated situation, here we advise that you take out your phone and begin recording. But make sure that you are not disrupting. Again, this can provoke the officers and further escalate the situation. If the vendor is not arrested after the interaction, make sure that you ask them if it's okay to share. And if approached by an officer, simply say, I'm not obstructing you in any way. I'm only exercising my legal right to observe the police while you're doing your job. Okay. And so here are a couple steps that you can take to do what you do, be a bystander and a better ally to vendors. Okay, so record. You can support vendors by safely recording video of any interaction with enforcement agencies. Again, you do have the right to record as long as you are not interfering with law enforcement activity. And I did see a question in the chat about what does it mean to be disrupting? Meaning don't try to take away the label that's being taken away. Don't get yourself in the middle of things. Step 2. Pia, sorry, next slide. Identify. While recording interactions, say the date, time, and location of the recording. If you can, read the name and the badge number of the enforcement officer out loud. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, document. Don't share the footage right away because again, this collaborative effort between you and the vendor at hand. Before publicly posting, ask for permission from the vendor and their family. Note the vendor's name and contact information. And if you want to do so, share the video with SCP, SCP's legal team by phone or message us on social media. Now, If you do share the video with us, please make sure that you attach contact information of the vendor. So this is a name, a phone number, and language that they speak. Only because in order for us to like follow up and ensure that the vendor does get the representation and support, we need to know who to follow up with. And I do want to challenge you. I know that there may be some barriers that you may encounter. A lot of the vendors who we work with and they're on the street, English is not their first language, but Google is a very powerful tool. So please use it. Google Translate, ideal, not always the best, but use it for these instances. If you don't speak the same language, use Google Translate. There's a speaker function that says the translation out loud and can be very useful. Yeah. Okay. And now we've spoken a little bit about what you can do. And we reviewed ins and outs of street vending. But I want to talk a little bit about our campaigns. Earlier this year, we embarked in the process alongside members to narrow down our priorities for the year. While these are not yet legislative bills, we know for certain that these are items that SVP members want to focus on based on their experience and the data struggles that they face. And so here's an overview of our 4 demands. Thing that we hearing over and over and that we see as a major issue and that you guys learned was a major issue is like formalization of this industry. So vendors want full formalization of the vending industry. 2, we want removal of NYPD / repealing the criminal liability that's attached to this. 3, we want to create more spaces for vending, like opening restricted streets, amending placement restrictions, and opening parks to vent. And then lastly, we want there to be an SBS sector dedicated for services for vendors. Right now, a restaurant can go to a small business service department of the city and access services that they may want, and it's a one-stop shop for them. But that's not the same for vendors. Vendors have to navigate so many agencies just to get the help that they need. So that's a little bit about our campaigns. And so now what you see here is the Courage to Change pledge. So Congressmember AOC has been very supportive of street vending for a long time. And council members, when campaigning last year for New York City Council, signed Courage to Change pledge, which included a question regarding support for licenses for street vendors. And that's outlined. Slide. And so following council members that we see here from the Bronx and Queens scored a perfect score on the pledge, meaning that committed to expanded access to licensing. So these are key council members to focus on and make sure that they keep their word and that we keep them to their word, right? Because we voted for them for a reason and we really want them to show their support for the street vending community. And I do want to echo that there are folks here from these council members who have been supportive of street vending and have all shared their support, but we want to ensure that that support is consistent throughout the time. So if you are a constituent of any of the districts, please follow up with your council members. Ask them what they're doing to support street vendors. And ask them how they're supporting your local neighbors. And to see a full list of the pledge candidates, you can visit the website that Karina's going to drop in the chat in a second. Oh, thank you, Pia. All right, so now over to Karina to talk about one of our other campaigns.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, so we have 2 campaigns, right? The Legalized Street Vending campaign, and which is in a collaboration with the New York City Street Vendor Justice Coalition. And then with the Fund Excluded Workers Coalition, we're advocating to create a parallel unemployment insurance program in New York State that's inclusive of excluded workers, meaning certain cash economy workers, undocumented workers, and low-income self-employed workers like street vendors. So folks who are not currently eligible for unemployment insurance benefits, but are actually paying into the unemployment system with their taxes, right? This had been a huge, huge issue for a very long time, but escalated even more so during the pandemic, right? When tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were out of work and ineligible for unemployment insurance. And so we're advocating for this long-term solution of a parallel unemployment insurance program in New York State. Next slide, please. So you've learned a lot today. You've gotten a lot of information. Hopefully you're angry, but you're also ready to take some action, right? That's why we love everybody who's out here supporting with Team AOC, is because y'all always take so much action, right? So how to get involved. There's a number of different ways to get involved in the campaigns, and I'm going to drop into the chat a volunteer sign-up form. So, you know, we're a very small team. There's 8 of us at the Street Vendor Project, working with, you know, thousands of vendors, 20,000 vendors. And we always love to get more involved with more folks who want to join in. So sign up here on the form if you want to join a phone banking session, right? As soon as we get those bills in, we're really excited to take a lot of action. If you want to join into a protest, if you have art skills, there may not be a lot of vendors in East Elmhurst, but a lot of folks who live in East Elmhurst and vend elsewhere, right? If you want to join into a march or rally, graphic design, there's a lot, if you speak another language besides English, right? We want you to join in and get involved. The second, next slide, please. Another way you can support if you don't have time is also to, you know, support SVP. We're, as I mentioned, we're a really small team, but we work very hard and we're very passionate about our work. And we rely on contributions from folks to continue our work. So if you're interested and able to, we would appreciate any support financially as well. Is that if you want to party with us, we are having a big celebration at the Queens Museum in October, on October 11th, where we're bringing in street vendors from across the city to have a little food celebration, but also celebrate that the Street Vendor Project has been organizing with vendors across the city for 21 years. So this has been a long time coming. We're turning 21 and ready to party. So I hope you could join us. And so now that's it for our presentation piece. I'll add in, but we have a lot of questions that have come up in the chat, right? So I'm seeing, I pulled in a couple. One was that, like, folks wondering about vendors getting involved in business associations. A question about street vendors franchising to work under a single license. Question about what's an art build. And then another one about, is it good to hide if you're recording or not? And a question about disruption. If you have more questions that I didn't just mention, I apologize, I missed it in the chat, but please drop it in again so we can answer them. Or, you know, feel free to raise your hand so you can come off mute as well. So I'll pass the first one to Jennifer. If you want to share to us, what is an art build?
Yes. So a lot of the things that make a campaign successful are the actions that we do with members. And so a couple of things that call attention to these actions and the things that we are doing to call on our demands are art builds. So essentially, they can be anything that can help amplify our message through art. So an art build can be like from a big hot dog stand. A couple of things that we have in the SCP office are actually pretzels, big, huge pretzel cutouts that we were able to do with the support of artists. So again, these may seem like small things to people who are arty, but they're like really handy when it comes to actions, and things that some of us just can't do. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, so if you're interested, definitely sign up. That's a fun way to break bread. We always have good food and good music, or we try. Another question was, can street vendors franchise so that they can work under a single license? I can take, yes, food is always provided by our members. So the answer to that is no. And this kind of relates to the other question about ending the exploitative practice of renting permits out, right? So the way that it works right now, because there is this limited number of, this is specifically for food vendors, is that there's a cap on the number of permits available, which means people are renting them from the original permit holder. And the way that the law is written is the permit holder doesn't actually ever have to be there in person, right? Most of the permit owners actually like live in Florida. They live in, they're just taking all of the money from the actual vendor who's working. Yeah, and I'll come back to Antonia's question or comment here. But with the passage of the law last year, we're actually changing the food vending system, right? So it's starting this year, actually. Should have started last month, but the health department is moving very slowly. But there will be a new system of street vending mobile food vendor permits that are going to be called now supervisory licenses. And supervisory licenses, when someone has a supervisory license, it means that in order for the food cart or truck to be operating, the person who holds the supervisory license has to be there at all times. So that kind of makes it so that person has to be present. So you can't be living in Florida, right? You have to be there at all times. It will create some complications though, right? Because there are some carts or trucks that are open 23 hours a day, right? And so they may need to have 2 supervisory license holders there to switch shifts, right? That brings us to the issue of there not being enough available, and the reason that we need to eliminate the cap and formalize the industry. There are right now, because there are some issues like, or because certain groups have preferential or have more access to licenses, like specifically military veterans. For general vendors, there are some systems in place where a merchandise vendor might do what's called, rent a vet, which means paying a military veteran to come and stand with them at all times that they're open, right? And you can see that in different areas across the city. It's not well advertised, right? Because it's a little bit of a tricky situation, but that is a dynamic that we see. Next question, and I hope that answered that okay. The next question was about, what does it mean to disrupt? And is it good to hide that you are recording? So yeah, no, and I just want to amplify what's in the chat, like not saying in any way that we should stop giving military veterans, access to this. This has been a very long time that veterans have been earning their place to have special access to street vending licenses and permits. But the reality is it is very difficult for many, including veterans themselves, right, to get access to certain types of permits and licenses. And the cap just needs to be eliminated. So the other question was, what does it mean to disrupt? And is it good to hide if you're recording? Do you want to take that one, Jennifer?
Yeah. And so again, I do want to say that you do have the right to film officers, whether they're NYPD, whether they're parks, any kind of agency, you do have the right to record. Again, something to keep in mind though is the safe distance. Make sure that you are not disrupting. And by disrupting, I mean getting involved with the interaction where you're literally getting in between an officer and the vendor. We want to avoid that at all costs. Anything that can potentially get you arrested is something that we want to avoid, because we want to make sure that you are also safe as a bystander. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and I think there's to add on to what Jennifer just shared, you know, it's something for you to consider as well. If you are undocumented, or if you have potential like things coming up with your immigration status, it's always something that you yourself want to evaluate. And you can also pull in other people if you're around others too, right? To see if there are others who can support you so that you're not alone in filming. The other thing I want to add as well with filming, and I see Tatiana who's on here, who actually had filmed a street vendor that we work with on Junction Boulevard in Queens, who the NYPD was approaching her as she was vending. She didn't have a permit. And there was, you know, because Tatiana took out her phone, right, and showed, and the police were able to see that she was filming, they actually left the scene, right? They may have also, you know, chosen not to, for whatever reason, using their discretion, chose not to issue a ticket or, you know, confiscate the food from the vendor. But a lot of times just that kind of presence is very powerful to show not only the vendor that they're supported, but show the police that somebody is watching and observing, and it's being caught on camera, right? So that creates a lot of good pressure that creates safety for the vendor. Another question was, can vendors get involved in business associations? So, oh, do you want to answer that one, Jennifer? So you come off mute.
No, I'm sorry. I had already come off mute.
Okay. Cool. I can take a stab at this one. So vendors are actually organizing their own associations in a lot of places, like in Corona Plaza in Queens. There's a very, very strong street vendors association that's formed with about 90 street vendors. SVP and our members have also formed bases all across the city. So on Fordham Road in the Bronx, in Midtown, in Corona Plaza, and a lot of different areas, vendors are really coming together to form their own associations to be able to advocate for themselves, right? There are also different types of business associations, like business improvement districts that operate all across the city. Vendors are not a part of those. They do not have a place on a bid board. Business improvement districts are called bids as well. Vendors don't have a place on bids because they, you know, don't pay property tax. And that is really the foundation of how a bid is formed, is based on property ownership. Other questions are, I see, can you clarify which interactions bystanders should get involved in? Just NYPD or also DCWP, Parks Department, etc. Clarify.
No. Yeah, can I jump onto that
Yeah,
one?
yeah, please.
Yeah, so something that I did miss earlier was to define a little bit about what each agency does. And so I want to expand on this question, but also mention that you can get involved in anything. You can, again, you do have to record any interaction you see happening in New York. So DCWP, usually the involvement that we see and interactions that we see between DCWP, again, Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, and NYPD happen to be that on streets and sidewalks. This is usually only on streets and sidewalks. I want to emphasize that. And usually it just involves like finding vendors or asking them to leave. And then we do have parks also involved who again find and ask to leave or can sometimes confiscate goods, and we've seen this happen. And NYPD is predominantly involved in the subway, as Karina mentioned earlier today, but their involvement can continue to ticketing, confiscation of goods, and ultimately an arrest. And then we do have the Department of Health and Sanitation who get involved. And if people remember last summer, or early fall, we saw the interaction that happened between DSNY and the Department of Police, NYPD, getting involved with the vendor Diana in the Bronx. And this is an example of the continued involvement that we see between NYPD and other agencies. So it's always good that you are recording any interaction that you see, because the only reason why we were able to find out about what went with Diana and the injustice and get all these like conversations started was because a community member filmed what was happening. So I do want to echo that your involvement in all of this is super important. But again, also remind you all to please check in with the vendor. And then when you do want to follow up with us, send us their contact information. That's super important for follow-up. And I'll end on that note.
Thanks, Jennifer. I see Maria Rodriguez's hand up. If you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. I just have a curious question. In case that somebody is being harassed, there's a way that we can buy the food before they throw it away or they take it away?
Unfortunately, we have a case with Diana, where there were community members in the video like saying, don't throw out the food. It was fresh produce being thrown out in one of the neighborhoods with the most food deserts. So unfortunately, anything that DSNY deems as garbage or a perishable item, they can discard without giving it back to community members or having the opportunity for them to buy it.
Yes, it's a waste of food. I'm just uplifting Robert's comment. It's a waste of food, and it's also, you know, it's really not the best way to be treating people, is to say the least. Another question that I've seen popping up is if vendors are invited to join like street fairs, like the Queen's Night Market or other markets across the city, do they need an individual permit? And so this kind of depends on if you're selling food or merchandise. For a lot of events like the Queen's Night Market or the Bronx Night Market or little pop-ups that you'll see, there's different types of licenses available if they're temporary that the person who's running the event can get. However, if you're a food vendor, you do need to have usually your mobile food vendor license or some sort of proof of your food, like your ability to handle food safely. Sometimes this also depends on, you know, you'll see people like giving food away for free, right? If food is being given away for free, you do not need a permit or a license. And so that's something that we often do at our events, right? Is we'll pay the vendor in advance and give the food out for free there so that we're able to work around that. If people are selling on privately owned properties, there's a specific type of permit for that property they can get that allows other vendors to set up there without needing a mobile food vendor permit. And then for some areas like plazas, right, that are run by the Department of Transportation, there's something that an event organizer can get called a concessionaire agreement, which means you can operate in that plaza for 29 days out of the year. So a lot of times when you see like a weekend night market or a weekend pop-up, that person will have, the event organizer will have gotten the concessionaire agreement and then can decide kind of who's able to come in and participate in that market. And that permit will cover everyone there. But again, the food vendors do need to have some sort of proof of food safety. Other questions in here was, can you clarify what is appropriate action from authorities when vendors are unpermitted or unlicensed? It's a tricky question. Appropriate, but legally, right? Legally, any vendor who is unlicensed or unpermitted is technically breaking the law, right? Because you're selling without a permit or a license. And so in that case, it's if you're a food vendor or a merchandise vendor, you could be fined, you could technically be arrested. And all of these are considered legal actions, right? I want to uplift this question or this comment from Robert, and then I see Gavina's hand raised. Is we should make it easier for people to get permits, but at the same time, we want to make sure the food we're getting is safe. And yes, like 100%, right? And that's why right now, every single vendor, even if you don't have a permit or license, even if you're working one day, a 3-hour shift on a food cart, you actually need to have your mobile food vendor license, right? Which means you've taken Department of Health's food safety courses and passed. You've taken this long 2-day course that unfortunately right now is only being offered in English, another issue. But again, it's very, very important, right? It's the same as anywhere you want to eat. You want to make sure your food is safe. And street vending is exactly the same. What is the, oh, sorry, Gavina, your hand is raised. And then to another question in the chat.
Hello.
Hi.
So my name is Gavina, and I like to, last weekend, by the ferry, there is a lot of vendors, and I see there's a lot of, who's these people? Are they parks or are they police? You see in the picture? Can you see them? Right? So
Yeah.
they're,
That looks
so
like parks.
looks like parks.
Yeah, that looks
So,
like the department.
about what they were saying to the vendors is to move out there. Well, this is a video. I recorded a video, but I didn't know I have to ask for permission. And because I didn't have enough memory to record, so I was wondering to do a Facebook Live, which is a big mistake, right? That's what I learned today. And how about, well, my question is, I live in Staten Island. Is anything in Staten Island that we can do? Who I can talk to or like that?
Okay, so Gabina, I can take your question, and we can connect offline if it's better to communicate in Spanish as well. And so really, again, it really depends on the type of escalation that we're seeing or type of situation that we're seeing. If it's a developing situation and you have the opportunity to ask the vendor to record, please do so. However, if it's already an escalated situation, then you pull out your phone and you do what you got to do. But you also want to make sure that you are touching base with the vendor afterwards. And that you are getting their contact information, because otherwise we can't support that vendor if we don't know who they are and if we can't do the problem. So reach out to us so that we can follow up with the vendor and you have their contact information. Please feel free to do so. And I'm gonna send you my contact information in the chat.
Thank you, Gavina. And I just want to share the reason why we could say that this was Parks Department as well, because one was looking at the badges on their arm, which had the Parks Department logo, and then also because they were wearing green. So always look for the logo or the badge on the officer. So sometimes DCWP, Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, they don't usually have a badge, but a lot of times they'll wear like a gray polo shirt and it will have the insignia here. And always look for like the guy with the iPad, because that's usually the person writing tickets. Other questions in here. There was one, why do vendors have to have their carts? What is the cost of cleaning, and why do they have to have them at certain locations versus cleaning themselves? So it's a good question. So for mobile food vendors, every single vendor, you need to bring your cart or truck to a commissary kitchen at least once every 24 hours. And a commissary kitchen is where sometimes like if a vendor only works a morning shift, right, it's like a coffee cart, they'll go at 2 in the morning, they'll load up the cart, they'll go out, they'll vend for part of the day and then come back and park the cart there overnight. But the reason that they have to go and park there is because it's the law, number one. Every single vendor, you cannot bring it home to your house. It must go to a Department of Health licensed commissary kitchen. So that's for both food safety and also because they have a lot of the equipment there. So they have, all the cleaning equipment. They also have a prep stations where vendors can prep their food in the morning. So get things out and ready to go. Other question in here was, what about carts that have the same name, like the Halal Guys? Are they franchises or companies that get around the permits? No, so often that will be, like Nuts for Nuts or Halal Guys, a lot of like the recognizable names, even like Bystander, who has 3 carts, right? Those are folks who all work together, right? And so right now, the way the system works is sometimes there might be one person or multiple people who are paying into the permit rental system. And then a lot of times folks will like purchase the carts or the trucks, and then they'll rent those out potentially to someone who wants to run the business, but then is kind of like in charge of setting their hours as well. So it's really on a case-by-case basis with a lot of these. Any other questions? Oh, does the same go for non-food goods in terms of where you park overnight? Or for Emma, do you want to take yourself off mute and share your question? So I'm not sure if it's the...
Hi, my question was in regards to earlier where you talked about if a food vendor is being arrested, the food gets thrown away. I was wondering if non-food merchandise also gets thrown away if a vendor's arrested.
It's a good question. So it's just perishable merchandise that gets thrown away. There is technically DSNY is supposed to check to see if there's somewhere that will accept fresh, if it's produce or fresh food, a place that will accept it. That doesn't always happen, right? But for non-perishable merchandise, even like Maria, whose video we showed earlier, so her mangoes were thrown out, but her cart, the police actually have to note it, and so that Maria can go and reclaim it from the precinct. And the same goes for all non-perishable merchandise. Again, it's not always the case, right? We've actually had lawsuits in the past because the Department of Health or because actually lost like 30 vendor carts or found them damaged to the point beyond use. And we actually won that lawsuit, and about 30 vendors were able to get a few $1,000s back. But it's a lot of pain and heartache that goes into that as well. Thank you to everybody for being so engaged and learning so much. This is, that chant that everybody says at the protests of "we keep us safe," right? This is exactly how, and these are actual steps that you can take, right, to protect yourself and protect those around you and help everyone else to thrive too. So yeah, go ahead, Jennifer, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say a few words for Spanish speakers because we do have a couple of Spanish speakers on the line today. Entonces, compañeros, gracias por unirse a este taller informativo y espero que pudieron haber aprendido algo, sacado algo de información que pueden relatar con algún compañero en su área. Y les recalco que el proyecto de vendedores ambulantes trabaja con varios idiomas. Así que si es que tienen alguna pregunta o duda, no dude de llamarnos. Nuestro número principal lo voy a poner en el chat. Así que gracias por todo y espero que todos tengan una buena noche.